Benjamin David Elliott sat in the courtroom of the Harris County Criminal District Court with a calmness that bordered on confidence. He was 21 years old, back straight, hands resting on the table in front of him, occasionally leaning over to speak with his defense attorney. At times, a faint but unmistakable smile crossed his face. It wasn't the smile of someone terrified of hearing a life-altering sentence. It was more like the smile of someone who believed his story would finally be believed. For many years after the death of his twin sister Meghan Elliott, Benjamin told only one version of what happened in the early morning hours of September 29, 2021.
You ever have like a really realistic nightmare? Where like just everything feels real, but also off at the same time?
He said it all began with a dream that felt too real. In that dream, he was holding a knife, and when he woke up, he found himself standing in Meghan's bedroom, blood on the bedsheets and the knife still in his hand. He said he had been sleepwalking. He said he had no idea what he was doing until it was too late. His attorneys built their entire defense strategy around that story. They told the court that Benjamin suffered from a rare sleep disorder, that he could perform complex actions while asleep without any awareness. And for a time, that explanation gave many people pause. There was no clear motive, no history of violence, and the victim was his twin sister, the one Benjamin was said to have always protected. Now facing him were 12 jurors who would decide whether that dream story was enough to explain a murder. But the prosecutors entered this trial with a very different plan. They believed the sleepwalking story was just a cover, and they were prepared to present details from the crime scene and autopsy reports that they said would show something entirely different. This is the story of a teenager who claimed he killed his sister while asleep, and a trial where forensic science forced everyone to re-examine that explanation. And every detail you are about to hear has been verified through court records, Harris County Police investigation reports, autopsy results, and prosecution documents presented in court. In the early morning hours of September 29, 2021, in a quiet residential neighborhood of Harris County, Texas, most people were still asleep while the sky remained dark. The streets were silent, the houses dark, and there was no sign that in just a few minutes, an emergency call would turn that morning into the beginning of a case that would spark controversy for years to come. At approximately 4:41 a.m., the Harris County 911 dispatch received a call from a teenager named Benjamin Elliott. His voice came through the phone, rushed and panicked. In the very first seconds, Benjamin said something that made the dispatcher pause to make sure she heard correctly. "I just killed my sister." The dispatcher immediately asked him to explain what had happened. Benjamin said he had just woken up from a dream so real that when he opened his eyes, it took him a few seconds to realize where he was. In that dream, he was holding a knife, and when he truly woke up, the knife was still in his hand. According to Benjamin, when he turned on the light in the bedroom, he realized he was standing next to the bed of his twin sister Meghan Elliott. Meghan was 17 years old at the time. She lay motionless on the bed, and blood had begun to soak into the bedsheets. In the room was still the knife Benjamin said he had used to stab her. The weapon was later identified as a military-style survival knife, an Air Force survival knife. That knife was not unfamiliar in the Elliott household. Benjamin's father had given it to him just one day earlier, on the evening of September 28, 2021. The Elliott family enjoyed camping and collecting survival gear, and this knife was just one of many such items in the home. But that morning, it became the weapon in a homicide. During the 911 call, Benjamin said that at first he thought it was all still part of the dream, but when he saw the blood and realized Meghan was lying motionless, he began to panic. The dispatcher switched to emergency guidance mode. They asked Benjamin to check if Meghan was still breathing. Benjamin said she was barely alive, almost unresponsive. The dispatcher instructed him to wake his parents and begin performing CPR. While keeping the line open, they guided Benjamin step by step. Place his hands on the victim's chest, compress the heart at a steady rhythm. Continue until medical personnel arrive. In that bedroom, Benjamin followed the instructions over the phone. He said he was trying to save his sister. Meanwhile, police cars and ambulances were dispatched to the Elliott family's address. When EMS personnel arrived at the scene, they quickly took over resuscitation efforts. But within minutes, they realized Meghan's condition was far more serious than the initial call suggested. She was not breathing on her own. There was no pulse. Medical personnel continued resuscitation measures for a short time, but they soon understood that her chances of survival were nearly non-existent. The wounds to her neck were too severe. Later, forensic pathologists would confirm what the first responders had begun to suspect. Meghan Elliott had not merely been injured. She had been stabbed in the neck twice. One of those stabs was particularly severe. The blade had severed both the carotid artery and the jugular vein, the two major blood vessels responsible for supplying and draining blood from the brain. With that type of injury, death can occur very quickly, sometimes within minutes. That meant even if Benjamin had begun chest compressions almost immediately after calling 911, it may already have been too late to save Meghan. As investigators began to closely examine the room where it all happened, they realized what lay before them was not just a simple scene of violence. Benjamin said it all began with a dream, but in that room were traces of a very real act. On the bed was Meghan's body. On the floor was the knife. In this house, a teenager had just told 911 dispatch that he had killed his own twin sister. Just hours after medical personnel confirmed Meghan Elliott's death, investigators from the Harris County Sheriff's Office began treating the entire Elliott family home as a homicide crime scene. Yellow tape was strung around the area, and officers moved in and out of the bedroom where Meghan was found, as crime scene photographs were taken from multiple angles. And every small detail began to be documented. The 17-year-old had called 911 and said he had just killed his twin sister. But for investigators, a story like that never stops at a single statement over the phone. That same morning, Benjamin Elliott was taken to the sheriff's office interview room in Houston. He sat in the room with two investigators at a metal table under cold fluorescent lights. The investigators wanted to hear the story again, this time in greater detail. Benjamin said he had gone to bed around 2:30 or 3:00 a.m. He said he had a very real dream. In that dream, he was holding a knife, and when he woke up, he realized he was in Meghan's bedroom. Blood was already on the bed, and the knife was still in his hand. When asked what happened next, Benjamin said he panicked, tried to use a pillow to stop Meghan's bleeding, then ran to get his phone and called 911. The investigators asked Benjamin a very specific question: how many times had he stabbed Meghan? Benjamin answered that he thought only once. But while the interview was taking place, elsewhere, forensic pathologists were beginning the autopsy on Meghan Elliott's body, and what they discovered immediately created a major problem for the story Benjamin had just told. Meghan had not been stabbed once, she had been stabbed twice. One of those two stabs was particularly severe. According to the Harris County Medical Examiner's report, the blade had penetrated approximately 4 inches into the victim's neck. That wound severed both the carotid artery and the jugular vein, two critical blood vessels supplying and draining blood from the brain. With this type of injury, death can occur very quickly, sometimes within minutes. That meant Meghan had almost no chance of survival after that stab. While the pathologists worked on the victim's body, investigators returned to the bedroom where it happened. They examined the walls, the floor, and the objects around the bed. One detail began to draw their attention. On the wall near Meghan's bed, there were no traces of blood spatter. That is not always unusual in a knife attack, but in this case, it made the investigators pause and think. If a knife is withdrawn from the neck after striking the carotid artery, blood typically sprays out with tremendous force. Those bloodstains usually hit the walls or surrounding surfaces, but in this room, the walls were nearly clean. That led prosecutors later to propose a different hypothesis about what may have happened. They believed Benjamin may have placed a pillow over Meghan's face when he withdrew the knife. That pillow could have blocked much of the spraying blood, preventing it from hitting the walls as it normally would. That hypothesis would later become a significant part of the prosecution's argument. But in the interview room, Benjamin continued to recount his story. The investigators asked him a series of questions about what he remembered. At one point in the conversation, one of the investigators asked Benjamin where his phone was. Benjamin replied that it was at the crime scene. That choice of words caught the investigators' attention. Many people would refer to their sister's bedroom in their home as at home or in her room. But Benjamin used the phrase crime scene, as if he were referring to a location in an investigative report. It proved nothing, but it caused the investigators to pay closer attention to how he described the events. Meanwhile, data from Benjamin's phone also began to be examined. Investigators discovered that he had used his phone until approximately 4:17 a.m. Just 24 minutes later, at 4:41 a.m., he called 911. The interval between those 2 points became one of the most critical time periods in the entire case. It was the period during which Benjamin said he had been asleep and then sleepwalking. But it was also the period during which investigators began trying to reconstruct step by step what had happened in Meghan's bedroom. While the interview continued, forensic teams worked at the scene. The knife was collected and sealed as evidence. Benjamin's phone was also retained for data analysis. The bedsheets and the pillow on Meghan's bed were removed, placed in evidence bags, and sent to the lab. In addition, investigators collected fingerprints from doorknobs, the bed frame, and nearby surfaces to determine whether anyone else had been in the room. Every object in that room could contain a small detail, and sometimes those small details are what decide a case. Investigators also photographed and videotaped the entire scene so the exact position of every item in the bedroom could be reconstructed. They measured distances from the bed to the wall, from the bed to the door, and noted the precise location of the knife when it was found. Everything was documented because in cases like this, the truth sometimes lies in details that initially seem unimportant. As they compared Benjamin Elliott's statements with the evidence collected at the scene and the autopsy results, investigators gradually realized that some details in his story did not fully align with what the physical evidence showed. Benjamin said everything happened in a hazy state, like a dream, but the signs of a knife attack indicated a specific sequence of actions had taken place in that bedroom. Those mismatches forced investigators to look at the entire case from a different angle. As they continued piecing together information from the scene, forensic records, and the interview, a new question began to emerge in the case file. If Meghan Elliott's death was truly a homicide, what had led to it? In many family homicides, the motive often becomes apparent fairly early. It could be a financial dispute, a long-standing personal conflict, or a sudden flare-up. But in the case of Benjamin and Meghan Elliott, investigators initially found no clear sign of any such thing. Those who knew the siblings said they were unusually close. Benjamin and Meghan were twins. They grew up in the same house in Harris County, attended the same school, and spent most of their time together. Friends described them as extremely bonded. There were no stories of serious arguments between them. No reports of Benjamin ever being violent toward Meghan before. To many, they seemed like two parts of the same small family rather than separate individuals. Meghan Elliott had been diagnosed with mild autism when she was young. That meant she sometimes struggled in social situations or when interacting with new people. People who knew the family said that in those moments, Meghan often turned to Benjamin. She stood close to him at large gatherings or when she felt uncomfortable, and Benjamin often acted as her protector, the one who helped her feel safer in those situations. While Meghan focused on creative interests like drawing and writing poetry, Benjamin was more interested in engineering and mechanics. At the time of the incident, Benjamin was a high school student preparing for the SAT scheduled for early October 2021. He had told investigators he wanted to study mechanical engineering after graduation. Friends described Benjamin as quiet, intelligent, and somewhat introverted, not the type to cause trouble. The Elliott family was also known in the local community as fairly positive. The children's mother worked with the Girl Scouts, and the whole family often participated in camping trips or outdoor activities. Acquaintances said they frequently saw the Elliott family together at community events or outings. In such a picture, the idea of one twin brother stabbing his twin sister to death with almost no clear explanation seemed unthinkable, and it was precisely that absence of motive that became one of the central points of the entire case. Benjamin's defense attorneys later emphasized that in court, they argued that without a motive, the sleepwalking story became more plausible. According to them, Benjamin had nothing to gain from Meghan's death. No insurance money, no family dispute, no personal reason that could explain such a violent act. But the prosecutors saw the issue differently. They did not accept that the lack of motive meant there was no motive. In many homicide cases, the true reason is known only to the perpetrator, and sometimes it is never fully revealed. During the investigation and later in the trial, the prosecution also noted a small detail in Benjamin's statements. In the initial interview, Benjamin mentioned that Meghan had gone through a period of depression earlier. That detail led prosecutors to question whether the picture of a perfect family was truly complete. They had no clear evidence of major conflict in the Elliott household. But they also did not rule out the possibility that there were issues that had never been spoken about. In their argument, the prosecution referred to the possibility that tensions within a family are sometimes invisible from the outside. What happens behind the closed doors of a home can be very different from the image neighbors and friends see. However, the defense strongly rebutted that hypothesis. They said investigators had found no evidence whatsoever of violence, hatred, or conflict between Benjamin and Meghan. According to them, speculating about a non-existent motive was just a way to fill gaps in the case file. And so, as the case approached trial, two completely different narratives began to take shape. On February 18, 2025, the trial of Benjamin David Elliott officially began. The courtroom was packed. The Elliott family, Meghan's friends, reporters, and many community residents were present. For them, the big question still lacked a clear answer. What really happened in that bedroom in the early morning hours of September 29, 2021? The prosecution was led by two Harris County prosecutors, Megan Long and Maroon Kutani. They entered the trial with the goal of convincing the jury that Meghan Elliott's death was not the result of sleepwalking, but a conscious act. Benjamin's defense built their entire strategy around a rare concept in criminal cases, the sleepwalking defense. According to their argument, Benjamin may have committed the act in a state of parasomnia, a type of sleep disorder that can cause a person to perform complex actions without awareness. To bolster this argument, the defense called the key expert witness, Dr. Gerald Simmons, a neurologist and sleep disorder specialist. Simmons explained to the court that parasomnia is a group of abnormal behaviors that occur during sleep, including sleepwalking. According to him, in some rare cases, a sleeping person can get up, move around the house, even perform complex actions without being awake. Simmons said he had conducted 2 sleep studies with Benjamin in the lab, each separated by about 6 weeks. In those studies, Benjamin was hooked up to devices monitoring brainwaves, breathing, and body movement during sleep. Simmons said the results showed Benjamin had signs of obstructive sleep apnea, a condition that causes airway obstruction during sleep and can lead to other sleep disturbances. More importantly, Simmons said Benjamin could enter slow-wave sleep in as little as 11 minutes after falling asleep. This is the deep sleep stage where sleepwalking typically occurs. According to Simmons, this made the scenario of Benjamin entering a parasomnia state during the time between 4017 a.m. and 4041 a.m. physiologically possible. For the defense, Simmons' testimony was the foundation of their entire argument. If Benjamin was truly in a parasomnia state, then the act of stabbing Meghan could have occurred without conscious intent or murderous intent. But prosecutors Megan Long and Maroon Kutani did not accept that argument without challenge. They called their own expert witness, Dr. Mark Pressman, a psychologist and researcher on sleep disorders. Pressman told the jury he did not believe Benjamin was sleepwalking at the time of the attack. According to him, the behaviors described in the case did not match what science knows about sleepwalking. Pressman explained that sleepwalkers can sometimes perform simple actions like walking around the house or opening doors, but carrying out a sequence of complex actions with high precision is different. In this case, Benjamin was said to have retrieved a survival knife, unsheathed it, and then stabbed precisely into Meghan's neck. According to Pressman, those are actions that require coordination and awareness that a sleeping person would find very difficult to perform. Prosecutors also highlighted another detail in Benjamin's statements. In the initial interview, Benjamin said he remembered the feeling of the knife entering Meghan's body. Pressman said that recalling such a specific sensation was inconsistent with sleepwalking. According to him, people who act in a parasomnia state usually have no detailed memory of their actions after waking up. Over 4 days of trial, the jury heard witnesses, experts, and investigators present every detail of the case. They listened to the 911 call from the early morning of September 29, 2021. They viewed crime scene photos and autopsy reports. They heard experts debate the science of sleep and the possibility that a person could commit a violent act while asleep. Each side tried to convince the jury that science was on their side. For the defense, the lack of motive and evidence of a sleep disorder were reasons to doubt that this could be an unconscious tragedy. For the prosecution, the forensic details in Benjamin's behavior showed the opposite. Finally, after 4 days of trial, both sides concluded their arguments. The judge instructed the jury on the legal standards they must apply in considering the case. When both sides finished their closing arguments in the February 2025 trial, the judge instructed the jury to retire to the deliberation room. 12 people entered the closed room with one sole task: decide whether Benjamin David Elliott was guilty of murder. They had heard 4 days of testimony, viewed crime scene photos, listened to the 911 call, and followed experts debating the science of sleep. Now all that information had to be weighed to reach a verdict. According to some jurors later, the first vote happened almost immediately. The initial results showed they were not unanimous. The jury was split 7-5, with 7 believing Benjamin was guilty and 5 still doubting. That meant the case was not yet decided. In the hours that followed, they went back over every detail in the file. They discussed Benjamin's statements in the interview. They talked about Benjamin remembering the feeling of the knife entering Meghan's body. They examined the arguments of the 2 sleep experts and debated whether a sleepwalker could perform such a precise action. The discussion lasted nearly 4 hours, and finally, they reached consensus. When the jury returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere became so quiet it was almost possible to hear paper moving on the table. Benjamin Elliott stood up when the judge requested. The jury foreman read the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Benjamin David Elliott, guilty of murder." Those words closed the most important part of the trial. In the first moment after hearing the verdict, Benjamin seemed stunned. His face hardened as he realized the jury had not believed the story he and his attorneys had presented. In the days that followed, Benjamin told the press he believed this verdict was a serious mistake by the justice system. He called it a miscarriage of justice, and continued to insist he did not intentionally kill Meghan. The Elliott family also reacted strongly to the trial's outcome. They said they believed Benjamin was innocent and felt the prosecution had made unsubstantiated speculations about motive. In particular, they expressed outrage at the prosecution's closing argument, in which prosecutors suggested there might be issues in the family that outsiders did not know about. For the Elliott family, those words were not just a legal tactic, but an insult to Meghan's memory and to the entire family. But in the courtroom, the jury's verdict had been delivered. And under the law, Benjamin Elliott was now convicted of murder in the death of his twin sister Meghan Elliott. Just one day later, the sentencing hearing was held in 2025. The courtroom was packed again. The Elliott family sat in the back rows, many of them still unable to fully accept the outcome of the previous day's trial. Benjamin, now 21, stood before the court to hear the final decision that would shape much of his future. Under Texas law, a murder conviction can lead to a very long sentence. Prosecutors Megan Long and Maroon Katani entered this phase with a clear recommendation. They asked the judge to impose a 40-year prison sentence. In their argument, the prosecution said the forensic evidence and Benjamin's behavior showed this was an intentional murder. They reiterated details presented at trial: 2 stabs to Meghan Elliott's neck, the wound severing the carotid artery and jugular vein, and the argument that such actions were inconsistent with sleepwalking. For them, the sentence needed to reflect the severity of that conduct. But in the same courtroom, another detail emerged. One juror had requested that the court consider leniency in sentencing. This person said the case involved highly unusual circumstances. This was not a murder between strangers or rivals. It was a tragedy between twin siblings in the same family. For some, that detail made deciding the sentence more complicated. As Judge Danilo Lacayo prepared to deliver the final ruling, the courtroom was nearly completely silent. Benjamin stood at the defendant's table looking straight ahead. His family sat behind him waiting. After considering the arguments from both sides, Judge Lacayo announced the sentence. Benjamin David Elliott was sentenced to 15 years in prison. That decision was much lower than the sentence the prosecution requested, but it was still long enough to change much of a 21-year-old's life. Under Texas justice system rules, Benjamin would be eligible for parole after serving a portion of the sentence, but that did not guarantee early release. After the sentencing, Benjamin continued to insist he did not intentionally kill Meghan. In later interviews, he repeated what he had said from the first day of the case. He said what happened in the early morning hours of September 29, 2021 was not a conscious act. He said he believed he was asleep when he held that knife. For Benjamin, this case was a mistake by the justice system. But for the jury and the court, the evidence had led to a different conclusion. When the trial ended and the sentence was pronounced, the legal story of the case may have concluded, but its central question continued to be raised in many discussions afterward. Was this a murder, or was it a tragedy that occurred during sleepwalking? And for many who followed the case, that question never received an answer that everyone agreed on. If you want to see more true crime cases with this level of investigative detail and forensic evidence, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Thank you for watching to the end, and see you in the next video.